So, bon dia. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Georgetown Global Dialogues, hosted by the CCCB here in Barcelona. My name is Gemma Saura, and I'm a journalist for La Vanguardia newspaper here in Barcelona. And, well, it's a real pleasure for me to be here moderating what promises to be a very interesting conversation about one of the topics of our times, which is the paths of de-Americanization. It's a process that we have been talking about for years now, certainly more acutely since the first presidency of Donald Trump. It's this gradual or not so gradual unraveling of the US-led global power, or global order, we could say even. It is a source of anxiety for some, of expectation or even excitement for others. When we talk about de-Americanization, it can mean many things. We can be talking about the shifting geopolitical power. We can be talking about the cultural change. We can even be talking about a transformation on how we imagine the world itself, no? Joseph Nye and Robert Keehan have writing that we might be witnessing the end of the long American century, referring to this century in which the US shaped not only global politics and economics, but also the ways the world thinks, dreams, and tells stories, and aspires, even. So there's many questions today. To what extent is this end of the US hegemony already happening? What does it mean politically, economically, culturally for the rest of us? And to explore all of this, we're in very good hands, because we're joined by three authors and thinkers who have long reflected on these issues. We have Nesrine Malik, who is a British Sudanese writer and journalist. She's the author of We Need New Stories. She writes for The Guardian and other outlets. She's originally from Sudan, but she's currently based in Kenya, which I didn't know. You told me this the other day. And Doha, yeah. So she's a person who has lots of vantage points, we can say. And then there's Mohsin Hamid, also a person who moves a lot. He's an acclaimed British-Pakistani novelist, author of The Reluctant Fundamentalists, Exit West, or The Last White Man. And when we spoke a few days ago, he was in Lahore. He spends most of his time there. But he's also a lot in the UK and the US, so also lots of perspective. And then we have Ben Ehrenreich, who's an American journalist, novelist, and essayist. He's written many essays. He has also lived in many places. He covered for many years, or for a few years, the West Bank. He now lives here in Barcelona for the past 7 years. So I'd like to begin by asking each of you what de-Americanization means to you personally, from your very different backgrounds and experiences. Nesrine, perhaps we can start with you. I think you wanted to tell us about your notion of America, a contradictory one, took shape while you were growing up in Sudan.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to start by talking about briefly why de-Americanize, right? We're talking about past de-Americanization because there is a fundamental assumption that de-Americanization is good. And it would be good to just establish at the top why this is a worthy endeavor. One is because the world is overexposed to a hegemon that even when it's led by not Donald Trump, is unreliable and corrosive. And the second reason is because the role of an imperialist power, unchecked in the world, whatever its politics or whatever, even if its best intentions, is an unsustainable situation. So there is a sort of politics of stabilization notion behind de-Americanization. I think a world that is overexposed America is a far less stable, far less precarious, far less volatile, far more precarious far more unstable and far more volatile world. So the point is to create peace, stability, and reduce volatility. I grew up in a region that was very overexposed to Americanization, both in terms of culture and in terms of military intervention. I grew up in Sudan, where we had a missile attack a few feet from the house that I was living in at the time. It was a few hours after the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke, so I think there may have been some correlation between the two. Certainly there were no follow-up attacks, so I'm assuming there was some correlation. The operation was called Infinite Reach, which still is chilling when I remember the name, because the sense at the time, we were teenagers, was that America can reach anywhere. It can get anywhere. Wherever you are, America can reach you. And so it was that sense of America as a very intimate, very close place because of its superior military and technological power, even though we had never been there and knew nothing about it. So that was the first, and then obviously the Iraq War, the Kuwait War, the presence of American troops in the region, in Saudi Arabia. These were things that were very present in our lives growing up. Controversies about having American troops on Arab soil, military air bases across the Gulf, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, a huge military presence in Egypt. So it's really hard to explain to people not from the region just how omnipresent America was, both notionally and politically. But there was a second aspect to exposure to America, which is a little bit more complicated, because even with all these narratives and understandings and resentments about America's negative role in the region, you know, it was the great Satan. There was always protests, American flags being burned. This was the sort of film reel of my childhood. There was also a lot of aspiration for America, right? A lot of hope and ambition to be either in America or of America in some way. And I'm not sure I've still quite unpacked why that was the case. Some of it was economic. You know, America was the place that symbolized the epitome of economic success. Some of it was cultural, in that there had been so much cultural projection. America was this place that had an outsized influence in terms of what we consumed, in terms of music, film, literature, and propaganda, actually. But I think the third element was maybe, and I hope we get into this a little bit later, because I think there's something key about this. There was a certain inferiority complex that had been assimilated from years of absorbing, I think, Cold War propaganda about the East, about the South, about the non-West, and about the non-American and the non-capitalist. And there was a sense that to purge that sense of inferiority, to not be the subaltern, to not be the other, you had to deracinate and shed your identity and become more American. And I think there's an entire generation of politicians from countries like the ones I grew up with and broadly from the non-West that still carry that inferiority complex around with them. And you can see in how it manifests and how they work in the Trump administration and other right-wing regimes across Europe. So yes, in answer to your question, de-Americanization means to me America just not being in your face, literally in your physical spaces, and in the guise of an aggressive military force in your territory, but also not being in your head, and not being in your conception or conceptualization of what success or prosperity or arrival means. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, we can. I noted, and we can go back to some of the questions you mentioned later. So you, Mohsin, you've written a lot about empires and transitions and the cycles of global power, how this particular shift the decline of US dominance is different from others that we've seen before?
Well, many of us haven't seen a shift in a while. We've seen shifts at the local level, but it's interesting today we're having this talk on de-Americanization, and I'm thinking very much of America because for many of us, or some of us in this room, our old friend Zoran Mamdani has won the mayoral election in New York City. And it has filled me with joy. My aunts are congratulating me. I don't know why they're congratulating me on WhatsApp. When somebody wins a mayoral election anywhere else in the world, this doesn't happen. Now, I bring it up partly because I'm so happy about it, but partly because it shows the incredible power that America has on our imagination, on our attention. The fact that I want to begin my talk on de-Americanization by talking about America, it seems almost impossible to avoid. And I think this points us in an interesting direction, which is that the gap between the material reality of our world and the world of ideas which we tend to inhabit has never been so vast in our lives. So as an example of this, when the last century started, there were 3 Europeans for every African. Now, there are more children who will be born in Nigeria this year than in all of Europe combined. When I was born, America was much bigger than Pakistan. This year, there will be far more babies born in Pakistan than there will be in the United States. The configuration of humanity is radically different from our imagination of it. And it is not just the people. You might say, oh, there's, masses of poor people out there desperate to come to the West or to America. And that's one way of thinking about the billions of human beings who are actually humanity. But I think the centrality of America in our imagination has caused us to under-imagine the reality of what it is to be a human being on planet Earth right now, to center our imagination in a very strange place. But you could say that, well, the power of America is such that, of course. But once again, we have to look at what domain that power occupies. It once occupied a material domain. America produced all of the world's manufactured goods after the Second World War, the vast majority of them. It no longer does. Some time ago, when I came back from America to Pakistan in 1980, many things that you might want were made in America. Today in Pakistan, it is almost impossible to find anything made in America. It may have an American brand, but the thing was not made there. And even more importantly, the things that were made there are few, are agricultural commodities. A particular brand of oatmeal, an American nut powder. There are agricultural products that America still does provide to the world to a certain extent, but not in some massive world-dominating capacity. But it no longer provides the physical goods that make up the reality of a human life, the things that you actually touch. And so if America, and the West in general, but America, isn't providing humanity, in other words, only a tiny number of future human beings will be living in the United States, and it isn't providing the physical goods that we encounter in our day-to-day lives, what is it providing? I think what it is providing is a system of ideas. Those ideas are software. Those ideas are finance. Those ideas are various, entertainment, news, media. Now, a power that rests upon these sorts of intangibles is actually a power that is, I think, on an incredibly shaky foundation. In other words, if you can shape the ideas of the world, but no longer constitute a significant portion of the humanity of the world or the things that human beings actually use and encounter, what are those ideas? And so I think what I'd love to speak more about and for us to discuss a bit is, are we now living in a moment where the gap between our ideas and the material reality of our planet and our humanity has grown so vast that de-Americanization is not something which, in a sense, one has to will into existence. It is an inexorable process that will unfold simply because our ideas no longer match earthly and human reality.
I want to discuss this later about the ideas no longer matching. I'm writing it down. If I forget, remind me. Ben, how do you see this transition between hegemonies that we are currently experiencing? I don't know if you want to talk about Gaza. What do you see in what happened in Gaza? If you see it as a reflection of these convulsed times that we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you, Gemma. And I'm going to, I'll play my usual role as Cassandra. And it's good we have like good news this morning as an introduction to what I'm going to say. And I'm going to read it because my brain no longer works for improvising. So I've spent a lot of my life writing about the various crimes of American empire in its foreign wars, but also in its treatment of its own population. But I'm not able to celebrate or feel particularly optimistic about its end, which I do believe is upon us, and which I think began at least 2 decades ago. We know from history that periods of transition between great global hegemons tend to be eras of sprawling catastrophe for many millions of people who live far from imperial capitals and who did not at any point profit from the rule of one empire or another. So think in the last century, as the British Empire gave way to American hegemony, of the global war that lasted from 1914 to 1945, with a pause in the middle there, kind of like the eye of a hurricane, one which Spain certainly didn't experience as a pause. Such imperial transitions do not only result in wars between great powers, but in widespread social unrest and upheaval, as the bonds of coercion and consent that maintained the previous global order begin to disintegrate. And we're seeing some of that already, I think. We've seen it in the heart of the empire. The protests sparked by the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police in the summer of 2020 were the largest protest movement in U.S. history. And it's easy to forget that now in the age of Trump 2. Arguably, the Arab Spring, which turned out to be more of an autumn, and more recently across the globe, from Bangladesh and Sri Lanka to Nepal and Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, France, Morocco, Peru, Indonesia, to name just a few. And also worth recalling, I think, is that these eras of transition are oftentimes of deadly innovation, and I mean deadly quite literally. Andreas Malm has written of the British Marine bombardment of the Palestinian city of Akka in 1840, while the Ottoman Empire was crumbling, as the first use of steam power in war, and hence the beginning of a new era of fossil-fueled militarism, which we are still living in. So for those unfamiliar with it, British steamships launched 48,000 shells against Akka in less than 2 hours, killing between 1,000 and 2,000 people and destroying defenses that for centuries had been considered impregnable. In the decades that followed, fossil fuels were repeatedly used in the service of imperial disciplinary power. Well before Dresden or Hiroshima, British steamships went on to devastate Kagoshima, Japan in 1863, Alexandria in 1882. Spanish steamers destroyed the Chilean city of Valparaiso in 1866, and the French leveled most of Casablanca in 1907. just a few years before with petroleum-powered airplanes, Europeans, first the Italians and soon after the Spanish, began bombing Africans from the air. Once the genie is out of the box, it cannot be easily stuffed back in. I say all this, and Gemma hinted at what I'm leading to here, because I'm very much afraid that the unprecedented destruction brought down on the people of Gaza over the last 2 years, this genocide conducted in large part with drones piloted by an artificial intelligence against targets chosen by one AI program and monitored with another, will not be seen 50 or 100 years from now as something exceptional, but as the beginning of a new era. On the one hand, the barbarous violence that Israel has unleashed is itself evidence, I think, of the collapse of US imperial power. Because the role played by the US in the region and the rest of the world has for a long time been to imagine itself a kind of benevolent parent, a great mediating force, the impartial protector of democracy, and the sole guarantor of human rights for all. You might not like us, but we're the only ones who guarantee your rights. Now, the deception and hypocrisy involved in this was always quite clear to people who were on the other side of American power. But the pressure on the US to maintain that narrative did, I think, encourage a degree of restraint. In Gaza, this role was definitively abandoned. In Gaza, we see the decisive end of the so-called rules-based order that the US has for 80 years claimed to represent. The genocide there, I fear, is also a terrifying harbinger of what may come. What was unallowable has been allowed, and what was unimaginable no longer needs imagining. The clear message that was sent by the US and by Israel in Gaza, with Europe's active consent, is that for the powerful at least, everything is permitted. And this is not a message that can be withdrawn. Everyone heard it and is still hearing it. And I think this is worth saying, not because I take pleasure in making prophecies of doom, but because the current conjuncture, which is made still more acute in ways we may still touch on by accelerating climate change, is so incredibly, incredibly dangerous. And if we can't see that accurately, we also can't begin to confront it.
Sorry to bring him here because I know you'd rather talk about Mamdani, but I want to ask about Donald Trump, whether you see him as an accelerator of this de-Americanization, someone whose policies and rhetoric hastened the erosion of the US influence, or you rather see him as a symptom of this erosion, or even a figure that is reacting against this loss of control, someone that is resisting this decline, that is clinging to a nostalgic idea of empire with his talks about invading Greenland, now in Nigeria, every day Gaza. So how do you see him? I don't know who wants to start.
I see him as both an accelerator and a symptom. I mean, we should not forget that the Gaza war began under Biden, and it was Trump who has brought it to this, what is still being called a ceasefire, though hundreds have been killed since it began. And I think we can go farther back and find signs of decline all along. And I think an empire that was healthy and sure of itself would not elect Donald Trump as its leader. I think it's been an extraordinary act of self-destruction. I can't think of like another historical example of such like a powerful act of self-mutilation as the election of Donald Trump, and he is dramatically accelerating this process. Yeah.
Sure. I agree. I think he is as both a symptom and an accelerant. But I don't think Donald Trump, in terms of what light he personally can shed on the trajectory of America, despite all the space he occupies, is actually not that interesting. I think what is interesting is the Democratic Party and the broader progressive establishment in the US and how they have responded to Trump and Trumpism, and what their answers are and what their affect is. And I think that is far more ghoulish and scary, because right-wingers, unhinged demagogues, people who want to capture the system for themselves will always exist, but what he has revealed is just how pregnable and how weak the system already is, number one, how the norms in America, or how the sort of separation of powers and the things that seemed to be quite established and concrete were basically a series of norms that people had agreed upon. And once that consensus was gone, very concrete things melted away. And I think he has revealed how even under such dramatic assault for freedom of speech, for freedom of due process, for the Supreme Court, for the Constitution, the progressive, maybe it's not even progressive establishment, but the Democrat establishment is still clinging on to very outdated notions of what America is, and retreating into safe spaces, talking about the American dream and American prosperity, and listening to Kamala Harris just feels like watching a black and white movie.
They should be talking about.
Yeah, well, they should be talking about what Zohran Mamdani is talking about. They should be talking about standards of living. They should be talking about how people struggle to survive and prosper. They should be talking about fraternity amongst different classes and different identities, like this sort of coalition building, majority building exercise that treats capital and treats the sort of extractive private interests as the number one enemy, is just not happening. And what you have is a Democrat Party that has become the party of billionaires and of workers, and that's just not going to work, because it's going to ultimately filter upwards to the influences of the most powerful, which is the billionaires and the financial establishment. So I think that is a scarier and potentially more useful lens through which to analyze why the decline is happening, and also what is the way forward. Because the way forward is not in showing people how bad Trump is, they don't vote for him anymore. I just don't, that's not the approach. The approach is how to present an alternative that is as compelling and visceral in the other direction.
So I think that Trump is very interesting because he's not really a businessman. Any of us who have been involved in running a business understands that, running a business is creating a product, making that product, getting it to customers, having people who work to make that product, caring for those people, putting something into the world. And what Trump is he is a salesman and a financial engineer. He creates an idea, a branded thing. He twists the tax code and the financing to allow him to make that thing, and he exits at great profit. Now, what's interesting about that is, as opposed to making actual things and having actual workers who form an actual community, what's interesting is that this, in a sense, is what he or his America is currently doing as a country, as an economy. Right now, what we see in the United States is we see a kind of mass delusion. That mass delusion tells us that somehow this promise of artificial intelligence will change everything. And because it will change everything, and because America will lead the world in this thing, America will be just fine. And the stock market is soaring, and people are building all sorts of stuff. Except none of it is measurably true. We haven't yet seen the ways in which this promised artificial intelligence will revolutionize the world. In other words, bring about change at a rate that is meaningfully much faster than the rate that we have seen in recent decades. And we haven't even seen any evidence that this artificial intelligence is in fact intelligence. What we have seen is the ability to produce facsimiles of human language that strike us as, accurate. But the basic question as to whether there's any intelligence there, there's no proof of that. We are being sold a kind of Trump Tower of an economy. We put AI on the logo on it and we put it into the world and the whole world looks at this. And what is really happening is colossal amounts of debt are being taken on. The United States is running a 6% of GDP budget deficit in a time of full unemployment and no war. Unprecedented. This whole thing, like a Trump project, is being jacked up with insane amounts of debt, which will eventually be defaulted either through inflation or through outright refusal to honor one's debts. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is I think that Trump is in a sense symptomatic of this divorce between ideas and reality reaching its sort of furthest extent. I think a crisis is inevitable. And I think that, to Ben's point, is that when these crises occur and when a hegemon is replaced or when a period of empire comes to an end, generally speaking, those are times of disaster for many people. But I would suggest that we now have the capacity to interact with each other, to recognize our interdependence, to begin to think about creating a new kind of world that collectively humanity has never had before. So while I agree that that traditionally moments like this have resulted in horror, and we're already seeing evidences of that horror. I was in Lahore when India and Pakistan nearly went to, well, actually did go, in a minor way, to war. And my daughter's math exam was canceled as I waited anxiously outside, and we could hear drones like impacting all over the city and anti-aircraft guns firing. These are symptoms of what you're talking about, right? This coming era of wars. But I think if we can allow ourselves to recognize that what Trump is saying and what the Trumpian economy, American economy is a sham, we can begin to reorient ourselves to thinking about what might we build in place of this. And I think we urgently need to do that if we want to avoid the horrible future that Ben, I think, has quite rightly alerted us to as the natural course of things.
Can I add? I think it's actually worse than a sham, because I think that AI does have a real promise, but the promise is that it will make work redundant, without any thought to what then happens to all the people who work in order to eat and put a roof over their heads. This is not on the mind of Sam Altman. The AI is this dream of the billionaire class to cut themselves loose from the mass of humanity, and that, put alongside its first great use on the planet, which is Gaza, is a truly terrifying notion. So yeah, I think the program is even more terrifying than you're making out. It's not just a sham. They are trying to take off from the rest of us and let us go.
But we'll see
I
about
want to
that.
say one thing about this, because I think this is this view, and that which I think is absolutely correct, is that there is a world in which AI does what you said. But so much of it depends on who owns it. I don't know if the Chinese are as terrified of finding themselves in a world where none of them have jobs. Because I suspect the Chinese imagine, or many Chinese imagine, that their state will do something about that. So the world that we are living in, where AI renders us all out of a job, is in fact a world of ideas that comes to us from an American position, where AI will be controlled by a limited number of plutocrats, and we will allow this to take that course. So regardless of the potency of the technology, its impact on human beings will be determined by the ideas and belief system inside which we allow this technology to exist.
although I find it quite terrifying to be in the hands of the state, not to be dependent on a state for your well-being. No, when you said that the Chinese are thinking that maybe the state. Well, let's talk about China maybe. So you talked about that we no longer share the same ideas. So if the U.S. Power crumbles or we become a more the power divides and they have to rule with other people. So we never really think who comes next. Is it China? Do you see China becoming a next unipolar superpower, or you think we are entering a more multi-power era? You think China is ready or even willing to fill this vacuum left of America, or do you see China leading another world? Are you hopeful?
I'd like to just reframe the question slightly, if I may, in that I'm not sure post-America means that there's a vacuum and that something else has to fill it. And I think one of the reasons why the conversation about what happens after America is one about anxiety and replacement, rather than what Ben rightly pointed out, which is that kind of period of transition, is because we have become so reliant and so accustomed to the notion of a policing power, right? And there doesn't need to be a policing power, or at least we should question the need for a policing power. And an interesting thing about China is that China has been in an incredibly dominant place for a very long time without that policing element. I'm from the African continent. China is ubiquitous in Africa and has been for decades, in ways that are I think surprising and shocking to people from outside the continent. It's in construction, it's in healthcare, it's in public-private partnerships, it is in schooling, it is in technology. Just to give you a tiny statistic, China creates mobile phones, builds mobile phones just for African consumption. There are 2 mobile phones that are made in China that are only sold in Africa. It is a supplier of 79% of Africa's telecoms and mobile phone usage. And so in terms of superpowerness, what that means, I think we need to start also interrogating why power has to be associated with hegemony, right? Why it has to be associated with policing, why it has to be associated with setting norms and values and principles. And just to go to Mohsen's point, and this might be kind of Pollyanna-ish, but I think there is potential for states to create their own sense of, not necessarily value system, but a system of kind of good neighbors, good fences make good neighbors, and cooperation is better than not cooperating. And you were already seeing these strange alliances and sort of strange characters embracing. You have, China, Russia, India in a room embracing, and the lion, the dragon dancing with the bear, which all feels a little bit surreal, but it's an expression of how these countries understand that shared interests are a safer way to go about things than confrontation. And so I think there are already a lot of countries that are occupying or coming into this void or stepping into the breach, some in good ways and some in bad ways. Some, like I said, China with its huge economic and infrastructural and actually debt loaning capacity in Africa and the Caribbean, but also the Gulf. The Gulf has stepped into the breach in ways that are corrosive, primarily North and Eastern Africa, and quasi-imperialist. But also, what I have seen in the past 6 months in the Gulf, vis-a-vis Palestine, still craven, still tucking in behind America, still looking out for their own self-interest, is something I have not seen ever, which is Qatar, Saudi, the UAE, Egypt, coming together with a little bit of actually conversations with Pakistan to try and figure out post the Hamas strike in Doha what can be done to forestall the fate of them being completely violated by this post-American world, in which that role that it played, Ben, of making sure that things don't get too out of control, has been abandoned. I'm not sure that answers your question, but I just would encourage us not to think of it as a void, because even though because I think the void has started and it's already being filled in good and in bad ways.
Where you see cooperation, frankly, I only see more and more nations, you know, the law of the strongest, becoming the rule of the world and acting on because all the countries that you mentioned taking alliances, at the end they are states that they have a very strong control on the lives of their citizens, where the democracy is very, very low. So in the end, it's a world where states decide what's best in their interest. Maybe what we had before was a scam, but at least someone was talking about democracy, about rights, about right now it seems that Russia can go into Ukraine because they know that nobody's going to stop them. China will probably do something about in Taiwan. The Gulf states that you have mentioned, all of them, I don't have to go into their history and what do they do with their minorities.
Yeah.
So I don't see this.
Yeah, I would just also encourage us to think: is that so much of a contrast to what it was like before? Is it so much of a contrast? I mean, I think we're talking about degrees of de-Americanization here. I think in terms of all the things you described, there was always degrees of this in the past. I mean, I think the assumption that America just suddenly fell off, and before there was this world in which peace and prosperity and protection of minorities and lack of invasions and interventionisms and stuff didn't exist, I just think is not accurate. So the first thing is how different was it in the past? It's a matter of degrees, I think, rather than material break. But the second answer is I don't know, actually. I don't know. I think it is most likely to be a period of transition where people will make mistakes and understand that cooperation is better than confrontation. But there's also questions now being asked in Europe about how to proceed without U.S. military capabilities. Also questions in Europe about how to cooperate vis-a-vis Israel without American support or American sanction. And so I think it'll probably be, I don't know, but I think it will probably be a mix of trial and error, of disaster and humbling, and also of cooperation and confrontation.
Go ahead.
I mean, maybe to bridge the gap a little bit, I think I agree with Gemma. I don't see any great cooperative idealism in Sisi or in Mohammed bin Salman or in Putin or any of these people. And I think these alliances are quite strategic, and I think the leaders of these countries think in terms of realpolitik, and they think in terms of power vacuum and taking opportunities and filling it and taking what resources they can, et cetera. But we are not the leaders of these countries. We are human citizens of some individual countries and people who can talk to one another. And I think it is never on this planet, I think, been more important to keep articulating a vision of humanity that is not a chauvinistic and nationalistic one, that is not about grabbing what we can in these, as the seas get higher. And I think, Mamdani's victory, to go back to this, is a victory of that kind of thinking. It's people seeing that this winner-take-all capitalist vision is utterly corrupt and is an absolute dead end. And I think, more than ever before, it's up to us, not just like writers and intellectuals sitting on stages, but like every single person on this planet to understand our fate and reach out to one another.
I completely agree with that. The one thing I would like to though say is that when I was talking about a different sort of world of ideas, I think, for example, already in this conversation, we began talking of the state and of China. But I think the framing of the conversation about China as a threat, as a potential hegemon, as a potential U.S. replacement or whatever, to me seems like this is the framing that we get from, in a sense, the U.S.-centered world. Let's decenter it for 1 second. What else might China be? So in Pakistan, in the last couple of years, individual citizens have bought and installed solar panels equivalent to 1/3 of the entire electricity generation capacity of the country with their own money. We're building a house, we're putting them on our roof. They're incredibly cheap. You can run a house, you can run even air conditioners, there's batteries coming. Now, what does it mean in a country of 250 million people if individuals can suddenly, for their tube wells, for their houses, for their agricultural, for their farms, deploy at scale massive amounts of, once you've put the panels up, sort of free energy? It's a very interesting question. So in a poor country like Pakistan, the capacity to have enough food, to have a decent life, is determined by a number of different things. But one of those things is the power available, the energy available to a population. What if Chinese innovations in solar panels and batteries are poised to radically transform energy availability for poor people in the world? Just as an example. Not who will prevail in a conflict over the Taiwan Straits, but in the material conditions of life on this planet, what might China have to offer? I think it's an interesting question just to ask. And then I think when we talk about the state, et cetera, to be honest, I don't know enough about the lived experience of Chinese people to feel that I can confidently speak to the degree of tyranny that they experience as people who live in China. But the sense I get is that it is not the case that most Chinese people feel that they live in a greater tyranny than most Americans do. I don't know if this is true or not, but I think it's worth us asking the question, opening our eyes, going there, looking around, and seeing what we find. Mm-hmm. So I think that if we move from a position where we imagine, is China the next hegemon, what is China and what can, to thinking, where might the world go from here? And just to reframe the questions and to think about what the answers might be, we might find different things. And the last thing I'll say about this is India and Pakistan right now are locked in a very consequential struggle. Because if there is an India-Pakistan nuclear exchange, it will be the most catastrophic war the world has ever seen. But it'll have consequences for the whole planet, and we are ominously close to that. Where might we look for dynamics to help disarm this India-Pakistan tension? I don't know. But I would be interested in finding out to what extent China can play some role in this. The West has no interest in intervening whatsoever. I think America has deeply destabilized the South Asian dynamic. I don't know if China will take us to the brink or not to the brink. But I'd just like to leave us with this question, not that China is some savior, but that the world that we see beyond, the world that is coming, a world which is no longer one of Western technological supremacy, a world which is not one where Westerners are the majority of human beings or even produce the majority of human output, is a world that will require us to think very differently about all these questions. And I think we should think differently about them.
Thank you. I think we can move to the questions of the public. If someone has questions, it's your time. Pankaj, you can start.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh. Hello. Oh, thank you. Thank you for this really incredibly stimulating conversation. I think, from the way the sort of question was phrased and then answered, I think a couple of things become clear, which is that Americanism as an ideology, which has been the most successful ideology of the last 70, 80 years, post-45 period, supported in at least initial phases by some very persuasive facts. The claim by America to lead the free world, to bring about regimes of democracy, which you were talking about, Gemma, can be verified by America's role in the post-war Europe in particular. The fact that a war-ravaged continent was actually transformed into imperfect democracies, but nevertheless there was this movement, and there were people genuinely committed to bringing about those regimes of human rights. But the record, of course, and this is why the perspectives from the Global South our panelists are offering are really important, because when you look at the experience of Asia and Africa, that ideology is too clearly seen as deceptive. The rhetoric of democracy and human rights is too rapidly exposed as hypocritical. And so, again, I mean, that's a separate thing altogether about how people respond, how people in these places respond to China today, because there isn't the same historical baggage, for instance, that America carries in those parts of the world. But that's a separate issue. What I'm trying to say is that American ideology, supported by facts, is in a bad way today because those facts have gone missing, as Mohsen pointed out. So the gap between rhetorical claims, ideological claims, and reality, as Mohsen said, it's just widened dramatically. So de-Americanization becomes a sort of inevitable process, because people are going to acknowledge the new reality, the cleverer people, in which category I would include this country's prime minister, who's realized that China is going to be a very important player. America is an unreliable partner, whether it comes to the defense of Europe or general sort of economic relations with South America. So he's gone to China. He traveled, Pedro Sanchez travels to China all the time. He's defying various European Union protocols by doing this, by forging this separate relationship with China. Chinese EVs are flooding local markets. I mean, there are various other collaborations happening. So that's one kind of de-Americanization. The other one I would say is and this is why I want to ask this question, connecting it to last night's events, is I feel like Zoran Mamdani represents another kind of de-Americanization within America, which is breaking free of an ideology of American supremacy, which was coded heavily with white supremacy, even when its most liberal forms. And I think that's, if you look at his speech, he's quoting Eugene Debs, he's quoting Jawaharlal Nehru in his speech a few hours ago, which indicates that he's basically saying this is a new reality we are inhabiting now. And this other stuff has become really, in a way, so farcical, and is now assuming very dangerous forms, of course, in the form of kind of naked anti-Semitism, racism. And so we need to reconfigure, we need to reconceptualize our sort of, this world we are living in. And so I want to ask, actually, I mean, any one of you could answer that, I think, but the need for de-Americanization within the United States.
I would add another beat to that, which is not just the need for de-Americanization within the United States, but the need for de-Americanization of how we interact with America and how we assimilate America outside the United States. I had a conversation with a West African Francophone writer who speaks French and resists notions or arguments to decolonize the sort of French language or literature in West Africa, because she says that the French we speak is our French. It's not their French. And so we don't need to decolonize how we speak because we have made it our own. And I think there are many ways in which we have made America our own. I think this room is a very good example of it. We are here under the auspices of Georgetown. When I'm in Doha in Qatar, I see very much a different version of Americanism that has been de-Americanized and assimilated and diversified, and actually picked and chosen one of the, like, you know, the literature, the art, the history, while also inflecting it with all sorts of local color and character. And so I think there's also, it's important not to, I think I agree, there's a clear path to that, and not a rebuking or a rejection of all that is American in that kind of redux 1980s America is the great Satan form, but an understanding that within Americanization, because, ironically and counterintuitively, because of its extension so much into the world, it has brought in the seeds of its own dilution, right? Not to sound like a right-wing podcaster, because that's the kind of stuff they say, but I mean it as a good thing. I'll stop there, so somebody else can have a go.
You know, I think I've had the strange experience over the last few years, but especially the last few months, as events in the U.S. accelerate, of real heartbreak, and realizing to a degree that I didn't understand in myself that I have these very strong patriotic feelings. That there is an America that I profoundly love, and it is not Donald Trump's America, and it's actually it is the America that he and his people are trying to destroy. And one of the things that I was thinking about before, when I saw the topic of this this talk, was this other America, which has also been incredibly powerful internationally. That the U.S. is this unique empire that has exported its own resistance. That in some ways, that has actually been, in many parts of the world, as important as General Electric or whatever, or the U.S. military, right? But like rap music. And you know, in many parts of the world, the Black Power movement, and our revolutionary movements, our culture of resistance, you know, which is founded in a very, very different reality than the one that J.D. Vance and Donald Trump and these people are coming from. And when I was back in the U.S. a couple of weeks ago, and it was like, I was in Los Angeles, which is a city where you know you feel the effect of the ICE raids in the streets, and it's very painful. But it's also like seeing my friends who look nothing like these men with their red ties, like gave me some strength and hope. And yeah, I think Mamdani's victory is a proud and open victory of that America, like the America that gave the world fucking Charlie Parker. And you know, that's something that I think I hope lasts, whatever this de-Americanization means.
So, may I?
Yeah, we have 3 minutes to close. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
First of all, I want to thank all of y'all for the great speeches. I'm Jerry. I'm from the Georgetown, DC campus. I have a few questions on the conversation about China. I think we have very intense and very great discussion about what China is and what China provides. Of course, China is a great country that provides a lot of means of accessibility, education, etc., for themselves and for other countries. But simultaneously, I also believe that we should recognize that they are an authoritarian country that suppress their own religious minority, that has really a predisposition towards suppressing their people, and also threaten my own people in Taiwan as well. So since we're really engaging in this conversation about anti-hegemony, anti-suppression, and forced solidarity, I'm wondering how you all believe that we should move towards a post-US world order without really reenacting the same problems that we criticize currently in the US hegemony.
I think that I don't think that China has the capacity to be as dominant in the world as the US was. So on the one hand, I think there are material changes to the world that China is bringing. Mass rollout of solar panels, but perhaps mass rollout of cheap thorium nuclear power plants. Who knows what it's going to be? Chemical innovations, But China's rise is the rise that occurs when a large number of people are educated and allowed to participate. And this is not happening only in China. It is also happening all over the global south. China will not find itself in the position of the US because the rest of the world will not remain in the position that it is now either. China will be a much more powerful country than it is today in a world full of countries that are much more powerful than they are today. And I think, for me, it comes back to this question that I think we're sort of circling around, which is, how might we find a way to be optimistic about de-Americanization? If we gaze upon the idea of de-Americanization with the standpoint of fear and of loss and the notion that this is something terrible, it of course seems terrifying to us. But if we can find something optimistic about it, we can start to conceive of what this better world might look like, which is the first step to organizing ourselves to partake of that world. And even, I think, for the United States, it's very important. A United States that is optimistic about a de-Americanized world is a United States that is perhaps much more likely to give us more of the Charlie Parkers and less of the Donald Trumps. So even for the United States to be a place that serves its working people well, that provides a greater quality of life to its citizens, that is a more decent and less violent place, I think that this can all go together. So I would encourage us, I think, just to try to find a way to be optimistic about what might come. But this would be a critical optimism, because I think Ben's stance that we could well be shuffling towards disaster is true. But I think the best way for us to configure ourselves to not do that is to have a critical optimism that says it is possible to go somewhere better. What might that look like? And what do we need to do to get there? And that is what is sorely so lacking in conversations about America, de-Americanization, hegemony, etc. We now need to think critically about what this optimistic future for humanity could be so that we can start going there.
Thank you. I know we're running out of time, so I'll just make just a brief comment and a question for us to think about. So, I don't think we have time to try to address it. But some of the things that have been going through my mind, and I'm glad you said what you said, Pankaj, is, are we thinking in strictly binary terms, right? Is it America or is it Americanization, de-Americanization? Is it America or China, right? And I think listening to you, Ben, it's really complex and multi-layered. And which America are we talking about as well? And I'm not going to say there are two Americas. There are many Americas, right, within America. And I think the way that we look at China and the way that China looks at the world is very different. So to your point, I don't think China is seeking the role that America has always sought in the world, right? We all aspired to be America. We all looked to American values. And that's, by the way, what explains, for example, the burning of the flags that we see over the centuries. As a Palestinian, for example, I can tell you that there's been more disappointment with America because America is the land of the free and the brave and the defender of democracy. And how can it allow Israel and this is, over the decades. One very quick thing on when you talked about cultural production coming out of America, universities are very interesting because those same people who were burning flags on the streets of whatever decades ago, they still wanted their kids, sons usually, to go to America to study. Now, and we are here under the Georgetown Global Dialogues. Is American education being de-Americanized, perhaps, Tom, by us going into the world? What's the role of other countries in Asia? Look at Korea, right, in terms of education and in terms of cultural production. I'll just end with something to think about, and that is, how does the rest of the world, including Europe, coming to see the Palestinian struggle for what it is, and even European governments pushing for recognition of Palestinian rights by recognizing a Palestinian state, is that going to, over the months and years, further isolate America and contribute to de-Americanization? But thank you, this was wonderful.
Okay, thank you so much for this. We're a bit late. It was really interesting.